Hi friends, Max El-Hag here. On this episode of the Corpus Animus podcast, I have TTT Coaches Mike McGoldrick and Kyle Ruth to talk about breathing. Get your breathe on with us. If you're on the go and you want to listen to just the audio version, subscribe to the Corpus Animus podcast on your favorite podcast app. If you want to learn more about becoming a professional coach, check out our interactive educational platform, The Classroom. Get a free 7-day trial at trainingthinktank.com/classroom trial.
One day I'm breathing cold, dry air and have Fran lung. And then the next day it's humid and feel like I'm suffocating. So it's like back and forth between two extremes right now. Not going to complain about it.
Contrast training.
Yeah, contrast training. I love it.
You just made a post about Fran lung the other day.
Oh man, Fran lung is gross. So since we're going to be talking about breathing, you want to dive into the concept of Fran lung and maybe we'll have some tangents from there.
Yeah, but you got to dive in. I can't dive in.
You wrote the article.
That was a question.
Do you want to dive in with me?
He was asking himself.
Would I like to dive in, referring to myself in third person?
Kyle, would you like to dive into explaining Fran lung?
Thanks for asking, Mike. I'd love to. All right. So Fran lung, why does it happen? So for most people, what happens is, the weather starts to change. You start to get some cold, dry air. The colder the air, the less moisture that the air can hold. And as a result of that, you're basically you're dehydrating your airways, which the result of that is that you basically have a harder time breathing afterward. You create airway inflammation. You create airway restriction. Your airways need to be hydrated in order to function properly. And as a result, you have this persistent cough that lasts forever. The increase in inflammation also makes it way more likely for you to get respiratory infections.
Yeah.
So most people don't know this, but elite endurance athletes, elite CrossFitters tend to have much higher frequency of respiratory infections than the general population. And that's, again, a result of constantly taking in really high volumes of super dry cold air, which over time, if you do that chronically, it can lead to things like COPD and like you take these people who are the epitome of health and they actually have respiratory issues. They have lung issues that they've created themselves by kind of subjecting themselves to that.
That goes in line with like a suppressed immune system too, with that style of training, right?
For sure.
Explain the copper penny taste. That's the one I get. People are like, tastes like blood. What is that?
Yeah. It's like eating blood.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I don't have an explanation for what that is, but I think that's a pretty common experience for anybody. It's like, that's the first signal that you're about to go into the Fran lung zone. Mm-hmm. Like you start to get that.
Yeah. You can taste it.
Yeah. And then as soon as that happens, like the whole, cycle triggers itself and you're in deep shit.
Noah put a series of posts out about the games, and one of them was talking about how difficult the trail run was and that he didn't really recover after that trail run. And part of that, from my observation, because I was staying in the hotel with him, was that he had Fran lung for basically the next full 2 days.
From the trail run.
Yeah. And also he trains in Miami, which is super humid, super warm air. Out in California, it was actually pretty chilly. Not like it went during the midday events when you were out on the field and it was sunny. It was warm in the sun, but the air was pretty cold.
Right.
And it was much drier than normal. And it was at the ranch. It's dusty. There's hay. I don't know if that's like an acclimation to it. Like, hey, you need to go out there and do it. Is there something you can do to prevent Fran lung from happening? Because it's not like you can change the ambient air is it ambient or the air humidity? Like go outside and be like, I need humidity up.
So the answer to that is like outside of medical interventions, like going and getting inhalers and things like that. Like, of course, there are things that you could do. Number one, you could nose breathe, right? So breathing through your nose humidifies the air. Mm-hmm. If the air is cold, it warms it. If the air is hot, it cools it, right? Like that's the function of the nose. But Noah wasn't going to be competitive in that race, a 10K brutal trail run, nose breathing. So in a competitive scenario, there's not much that you can do. I think some of the strategies, at least that I've read and that I've employed for myself as someone who does suffer from, I've got I had exercise-induced asthma really badly, but I've really been able to decrease that just by doing things to increase CO2 tolerance to make it so that as soon as I get done with a Metcon, I switch back to nose breathing quickly so that I'm breathing in humidified air again and like conditioning the air that's going into my lungs, warm up effectively with nose breathing. But that's not going to prevent it in something like a 10K trail race when you go from a humid environment directly into your forest fire, California dry environment.
Yeah, I was going to ask what the air quality was like too for those guys.
This makes me feel like I didn't prepare enough or I didn't pay attention enough, but I didn't look at the air quality index map until after the games was over. And I was in Southern California where there were forest fires. People had talked about air quality, but everyone around was just saying, oh, the air quality is pretty good. I didn't even pay attention to it. I'm also not sure what there would have been that would have been actionable. If they're like, air quality is not great, we still would have been working out.
I don't think the athletes should have known. I'd have been like, hey coach, lie to me. Tell me it's great. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. It's crazy how you can have an intense effort like that, like respiratory effort, and it sticks with you for like 3 days. I've had the same sensation before after doing like a really short, heavy breathing Metcon, and like 3 days later, I'm like still like,
it's like a low level sickness. I mean,
it's weird.
You are technically like running your immune system down. You might actually be kind of in the same physiological state as if you got a low level sickness, right?
Well, it's an inflammatory thing, right? So your airways are actually inflamed and constricted, and inflammation is one of the things that happens when you have a respiratory infection. So some of the symptoms are going to be really similar, despite the fact that you may not have an active infection. You still have that inflammation. And I think there may be ways to deal with it. Like I said, I think some of the nose breathing stuff may help people deal with it. I think even some breath holds might be a way to deal with it, because you're temporarily raising nitric oxide and CO2 levels in the lungs, which could have a positive impact on dilating the airways. But again, it's not going to be like I don't think it's like a solve for something as extreme as running a 10K in a dry environment with smoke and all those things.
You got something? Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, just for the sake of this show, I think this is like a good way to kind of step into what we're talking about in this episode, is that we're going to bring up some like different problems that we see with breathing in sport, and then talk about different training application or training principles that we use to maybe solve those problems. So like with this, it would be nasal breathing as a tool to potentially help with that. That's kind of like a weird one that we don't know a lot about. Not like the main thing that we would use nasal breathing training for, but that's just like kind of a good segue into how we're going to organize basically a topic that's huge and we could talk about for 2 hours. So this is a bit of an overview.
Yeah, we can't go into depth on everyone prior to getting into the major issues, because I think there's probably common ones we can hit on. I wanted to pose a quick question that popped up into my head. So most of the physiological research on breathing and endurance breathing would indicate that faster respiration is necessary, 60 breaths a minute to be able to ventilate enough O2, CO2. There's a huge move by a lot of the people that I would call in like the breathing community, even if you read Breathe or Oxygen Advantage, that people talk about the slowing of respiration. Now, most of the research, I talked to Evan about this, most of the research that's done on those are people at very low wattages and very low outputs. It's not like high level performance. So is there a place for high speed movement, high levels of endurance at slow respiration rates? Or are we just going to need to train people to breathe fast to put out the types of power output? And this is kind of like theoretical. I know neither of you did research.
I think that's a really excellent question, but actually in Oxygen Advantage, I just read it recently, so this is pretty fresh. Pat McEwen or McCowan, I'm not sure entirely how to say it, but he talks about the fact that that at certain intensities, you're going to have to switch to higher respiration rates. But that you should spend the majority of your time, at least at rest or lower intensities, with slower respiration rates. So that if you're an elite athlete, you need to train both ends of the spectrum, just like we would say on, you need to train maximal strength, and you need to be able to do 100 thrusters with an empty barbell, quickly. Like you need to train both ends of the spectrum. The same is true for breathing, that you need to have very or highly adaptable breathing, but that the majority of the time you should have a relatively low, not even a low respiration rate, but slow, shallower breathing at rest would be the recommendation. I think I would agree with him just based on my own experience. And like, I was probably a chronic overbreather and learning to slow down my respiration rate at lower intensities has helped me breathe better when I am at high respiration rates at high intensities.
Yeah, I think just from coaching application, I have not seen it be helpful yet in a performance setting, like using nasal breathing in like a high intensity performance setting. Like no one's done Fran yet through their nose and PR'd their time, right? They've actually done better, right? Prove me wrong, we haven't seen it yet. But as a training tool, for sure, tons of application. I just think at a lower intensity setting. So like you want to bridge someone into it, right? Like I'm not going to give them hard intervals and expect them to have like a strong output on the rower if they've never done any nasal breathing work before. We're going to start with something like just walking and learning to breathe through your nose only for 20 minutes. And for some people, that's such a psychological challenge. They're like, like they're so used to breathing through their mouth, or when they perceive any level of like heightened respiratory stress, the first thing you want to do is kind of like gasp and get in more air. So like, that's just kind of a way to bridge into it. So like as I was saying, I haven't seen it in like a really intense setting yet be effective.
So one of the common issues, and I think I probably had this issue for a while, and that I see in CrossFitters, is a suppression of fast breathing. So you see a lot of coaches, like somebody's doing a Metcon and somebody starts to hyperventilate, starts to breathe really quick. And you'll actually hear a coach give a cue, slow your breathing. And I think I took that in. It was common in football during our conditioning sessions for our coaches to yell, don't breathe like a fat kid. Because, the panting, like if you've ever seen a bulldog breathe,
It reminds me of Little Giant.
Yeah. But there is some sort of a need for that. And I think that there can be too much of a cerebral thinking of trying to do what is good breathing during this. And people try to do good breathing in a performance setting when they should be focused on the performance and allowing breathing to be adaptable to allow them to do that.
Well, I think to that point, since we're having a little more of a theoretical conversation, I think on the one hand, there is over breathing, which is a mismatch of respiration rate, where respiration rate is way higher than the demand for oxygen intake and CO2, output. Yeah. Then you have what would be like optimal breathing, which would be someone's moving at high intensity. So they have a high respiration rate where O2 intake and CO2 output are matched to their exercise intensity. And I think what happens for most people, most of the CrossFitters that I've worked with, they have over breathing.
When you say over breathing, sorry to cut you off. Yeah. Would you possibly say over inhalation?
Yeah, I think that might be true, but I really think that over inhalation is stimulated because they're having a hard time getting CO2 out, or they are not tolerant enough of elevated partial pressures of CO2 in the blood. And so the result is that they have very high ventilation rates that actually exceed the need for oxygen intake and CO2 output. And that's what I see quite a bit of. And I think that's when you hear, I think what coaches are trying to do is trying to get people not to overbreathe. They just are giving the wrong cues on how to do it, because just taking someone who has this like reflexive drive to breathe really fast because their partial pressure of CO2 in the blood's really high because they're working hard, and you say, oh, slow down your breathing. That's not going to do anything positive for them. It's just going to make them feel like shit. Right. So you actually have to go back and train that breathing mechanism separately from like the high intensity training and things like that. Integrate, like you said, integrating nose breathing at low intensities, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. I think just the sensation of being out of breath is a thing to train, because like you were saying, like I've had some athletes, I used to tell them like, you got to calm your breathing in Metcons, you got to slow down. And I'm like, I'm just basically restricting how much air they're getting in now. And they're trying to calm down, but it's like, sometimes like it's okay to hyperventilate, like just let your breathing go and be natural with it and be okay with the feeling of your breath kind of being extremely, like your respiratory rate being extremely high and elevated. That's just something a sensation that you have to train and be okay with in certain settings, because you're not doing that for an extended amount of time. You're looking at 12 to 15 minute workouts at most.
Yeah. And it'll go back to normal, once you're out of that situation. So that'd be one common issue that people deal with. Would that be just over breathing?
I think
inability to breathe properly during intensity,
even being too, or monitoring their breathing, or being too connected to their respiration rate to control their exercise intensity, which I think is that problem in and of itself, where they're like, oh man, my breathing rate got so high, I couldn't keep going. And that's kind of what Mike was talking about. It's like, well, what you need to do is you need to learn to be okay with that high respiration rate. And maybe if they are overbreathing, that might not be possible, because the sensation or that panic feeling of having elevated CO2 might bring them to a screeching halt, because it is almost like an anxious, anxiety inducing feeling. But at the same time, just learning to be more comfortable at high respiration rates is important. I think, we've talked about in other podcasts, Max and I have talked about using running to help people get more comfortable in longer Metcons. I think that might be the function that some of that running is actually serving, is that it's getting people to be more comfortable at high respiration rates. Because what better way to get people breathing fast for long durations than to go do a long, hard run?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically the highest power output thing that you do. You're
Especially
moving
for
your
big
whole
athletes.
body weight for, at a pretty big distance, and you're doing it with a pretty fast contraction turnover.
Yeah, the heart rate tells a story on that. If you put someone on a bike, put them on a rower, and then have them run at the same RPE, the heart rate's always going to be elevated a lot higher on a run.
Yeah.
So just the amount of muscle mass you're recruiting and the tax that it has on your midline to support your spine, I think is like fantastic for driving up respiratory rate really quick if you're trying to do it like in an interval type setting. So obviously like we train for the open and things like that, and running's never been in the open. So like as a bias, we're like rarely putting it in because we don't feel it's super important. Obviously, like for sanctional athletes, they need year-round touches on that stuff, but I still use running at like the beginning of certain intervals to just basically get more bang for my buck in terms of energy expenditure going into a session if I'm doing strength endurance work or repeated, barbell lifting, that type stuff.
Yeah. So I want to make sure that we have some sort of structure since this topic is so big. So we have like over breathing or mismatch of breathing. Some tools that you could do is endurance work with running. I'd say also, I read something, it might've been in Breathe, but that treating anxiety from a medical perspective, they actually used to use CO2, direct CO2 inhalation. So you breathe in, your body basically goes into this from one breath of full CO2, your body goes into this complete and utter panic because it thinks you're suffocating. You're not actually suffocating because it's only one breath. And by getting that exposure repeatedly, I think they did it one time per
once a week
for a short period of time, it would actually re-alter people's CO2 tolerance and then actually ease anxiety, medical anxiety, not
for an entire week from one exposure, maybe two exposures of CO2 in the lab.
So obviously we're not doctors. We're not saying do this for your actual
Don't go
anxiety.
do whippets.
That's not CO2. That's nitrous, right?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. But I
do know it's nitrous.
Kyle huffs it. For me, I know that I am generally a pretty calm person. I generally have a cool head about me, but if I'm in a high intensity Metcon format, I am way anxious relative to my normal self in a non-stress situation. That could just be a CO2 tolerance issue. So some tools that I've been using for myself would be breath retention, breath holds, and actually just getting comfortable. It started realizing how big of a problem it was when I was doing swimming stuff. Because
agreed. Yeah.
Three breath rest drills
I mean, how many times did I tell you that I hated that? Like it was the worst. For you, it's super calming. And for me, it felt like I was drowning.
No, I did my first swim session since basically I competed at Masters Fitness Collective. So it's been 3.5 months and I did.
So I'm faster than you now.
Yeah, you're definitely faster than me now, Mike. I've regressed that much in 3 months. No, I did some 3 breath rest. And even though I've been doing breath holds and, static apnea and these different things, it's still so uncomfortable the first time you do it again.
Yeah. 3 breath rests. So Kyle's swimming down the pool. He gets to the wall. And then instead of getting, just holding on with his head out of the water and just doing a normal breath cycle to calm, you actually use the water. So you go underneath the water and you breathe out, and then you come up and you get a breath, and then you go immediately back under the water and breathe out. And you basically just use the water to regulate your breath, and you get 3 breaths at the wall, which is where the name 3 breath rest comes. And then you go.
Yeah. Make sure you don't get that backwards either.
Inhale. But to that point, one of the things you're trying to do is slow your exhale as much as possible. And the longer you can get that exhale to last, the more you're tolerating CO2. And so it's an interesting thing to do when you haven't been in the water for a while. Because I think swimming in general, Mike, you've talked about this before, but swimming in general does induce that sense of panic. But a lot of times that's a result of improving your CO2 tolerance.
Yeah, 100%. That was like the aha moment for me with swimming, and just kind of like the application of breath retention holds, breath holding. When I would swim, I basically constantly felt like I was always gasping for air. Like no matter how long I prolonged my stroke with my head out of water, I felt like I could not get enough air in. So it was just like that constant hunger sensation of needing more air the whole time. started adding in breath retention holds beforehand. And I would say like, it felt like the set point of when that panic switch would hit was just raised. It just made it feel like I didn't have that gasp reflex so quickly all the time. So it was just good practice, and it made my swimming like a ton better. It just helped me relax and feel less out of breath. Started doing it in Metcons, and it helps a lot too.
Yeah. So breath holds, running, nasal breathing.
I would add
swimming.
to that, getting people to return to like relaxed breathing as quickly as possible after a Metcon, even though that's very uncomfortable, right? You get done with a Metcon, and what you really want to do is just like sit there or lay there and just pant, right?
Yeah.
That's what the inclination is. But if you want to train your tolerance of that sensation of breathlessness, then one of the things you can do is, consciously get yourself to return to relaxed breathing. It's not going to feel good. It might be the most uncomfortable thing that you do out of the entire session, but it's one of those things that could really train your ability to return to, relaxed breathing pretty quickly.
Yeah. What's the benefit of that?
I think the same thing. I think it's just getting you more tolerant of breathlessness sensations.
Got it.
I also think it might be, I think personally, it might be a way to train how quickly you can recover your respiration rate, like between intervals. So if you're at a competition and you have like an every 3-minute workout where you have 2 minutes of work and 1 minute of rest, the advantage is always going to go to the person who can recover their breathing quickly. And so it's actually training your ability to recover your breathing fast.
Yep. Thank you, Chris. Shannon came down from the ceiling. Yeah. So I would say like the big problem, tolerance, comfortability with high respiration rate. And those are the tools that we just kind of explained.
And that was a lot of tools.
That was a lot of tools.
Yeah. From a tool perspective, we'll kind of circle back to this, but if you go to our YouTube playlist, we have a breathing specific playlist where I actually talk about breath retention drills and give you a couple examples as a starting point. It's not like a full comprehensive list of every single breath retention tool you can have, but it's enough to kind of get you started on that process. So what other big issues do we see breathing in the sport?
Well, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say one that comes to mind right away is comfort under load or compression, right? So being loaded under a barbell, compressed with kettlebells and a front rack lunge. I've actually seen this in multiple applications, not just in CrossFit, but in sport as well. So like maybe a hockey player that's wearing pads that obviously like football's a little different. You're doing very short sprints. You get time to rest, but hockey, you're going for 90 seconds at a time, and you've got a bunch of equipment on you compressing your rib cage. So I would say that kind of dives into some IMT training a little bit.
Yeah. IMT, inspiratory muscle training. So basically improving the strength of your ability to inhale and pull in oxygen against a compressive force on your stomach. And that could be true, like CrossFit specifically, like Mike said, with kettlebells or repeat squat cleans, or you're carrying a sandbag or double kettlebell front rack lunges, any of that type of
weighted vest.
Weighted vest, yeah.
Which is like elastically compressing the weight's compressing, and you have the elastic compression of the straps actually compressing that to you.
Yeah, I think it's two things. It's one, it's the ability to make sure you can get a strong inhalation, but also the endurance of that. So like if you're running a mile with a vest and over time you just start to shrink down, and the inspiratory muscles don't have the endurance to continuously expand and get in enough air. Like you're running, you're not always going to belly breathe. It's just not going to be perfect, right? But you need to still have the strength of the upper rib musculature to expand and draw in air. And I think that that's something that needs to be trained for some people. So
yeah,
we'll go into more specifics with the sport. No, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think my background in sport, just, a lot of grappling, wrestling, football, contact sports where you have to brace. Then you get into something like CrossFit, and it just, if you said, okay, is Max a good breather or bad breather, a skill like that, I might actually have previously developed, but like the first skill that we're talking about, being able to breathe continuously, deal with breathlessness, deal with fast respiration rates, that aspect of breathing is kind of poor. So it's also important for people in the sport who want to be good at the sport to identify if breathing is a limitation on specific workouts, why? What is the limitation that you're talking about that you have to train? Because for me, if I do a bunch of inspiratory muscle training, it might not make me better at the things I need to be better at in the sport. I got to actually focus on CO2 tolerance, fast respiration rates, matching, dealing with that anxiety and not allowing it to make me overbreathe. So just
to that point, a good way to assess yourself might be to look at the types of workouts that where you feel your breathing is a limiter for you. If they tend to be workouts that are like anteriorly loaded, like front squats, thrusters, double kettlebell work, if those are the things that really spike your breathing, then it might be an inspiratory muscle issue. If it's more like high turnover, high power, like not even high power output, but like low barrier to entry, double under, burpee type stuff, that where you feel like your breathing is more of a limiter, that might be more of a CO2 tolerance issue. And so you could kind of start to look at the types of workouts that are limiting you and use that to kind of guide the type of training that you might do.
Yeah. One of the tools that we use is the power lung. And where I started using this was, here's an example of one of the athletes I have. So, I would read training notes, front squat, 5 sets of 5. And every time the notes would say, I felt like I was out of breath, smoked. I could not recover between sets. I'm like, all right, let's just increase the rest, just go like completely rest as needed. Cause I was giving him like 2 to 3 minutes rest. He was like, still, I'm so out of breath. I'm like, what's going on? 5 reps. Like just hold your breath for the 5 reps, but back squats, no issue at all. Right. So something about being front loaded and compressed was a weakness for this athlete that he could not get air in and, maintain during through a strength set. So we're not even talking about a Metcon. Come on site, did some testing, and we pull out the power lung just to kind of see like, all right, well, how strong is his inhalation? Couldn't budge the first setting on a power lung. So I think to your point of actually needing to assess it a little bit further to make sure, okay, maybe this is a thing that you need to kind of break down and pick apart a little bit. Come to find out, he's got some inhalation weakness issues. I
remember you telling me about this. Yeah.
So we, I was like, all right, well, I'm not going to recommend everyone go buy a power lung because that's really specific, but it really helped his strength work because he was able to draw in more oxygen and recover better between sets and was actually just getting stronger through front squat loading, et cetera.
Yeah.
Just from using the power lung. So it helped the sensation and helped his strength.
A power lung is basically like a mouthpiece you hold on to that has a resistance setting for breathing in and a resistance setting for breathing out, that you basically are doing resisted breathing. The only downside. So a Spiro Tiger has a bag where you're rebreathing some of the CO2 so you don't pass out from
my understanding, the Spiro Tiger is a little more of a versatile tool because it can do what you do with a power lung, but it also allows you to train respiratory endurance, which would be very low, like low resistance, but high respiratory cadence or a high respiratory rate. Whereas the power lung is more, I think of it as like respiratory strength.
Exactly.
So what Mike's application of power lung for that athlete was like, spot on, right? You've got this athlete who has a very clear inspiratory muscle strength deficit, and you addressed it with the power lung. But I think there's also, to speak to the power lung a little bit, I think there's the concept of strength reserve, right? So the stronger you get someone's inspiratory muscles, just as an example, the easier each like low level or low loaded inspiratory muscle contraction is. And so you're reducing the energy cost of breathing by making the respiratory muscle stronger. So even for someone who has a respiratory endurance limitation, something like a power lung could potentially have some application there.
Yeah. Other tools I've found, wrapping, like, how you do a normal knee wrap or voodoo floss, wrapping that around your thoracic cage and breathing against it to give you kind of that tactile feedback and some resistance to breathe against, just as maybe like a warm up before you're doing a squat clean and walking lunge type workout that we're constantly under load.
I think the tactile feedback is where the more of the application is with that. Cause I've tried to use it for like actual strength loading, or like try to like push into it. And it's not really like, you don't get like a large range of motion with your rib cage. It's more about like, oh, I feel this on me. So let me just be conscious of like, really trying to expand the ribs. And my freaking rib cage cramps. I just cramp right now doing that. It'll cramp when doing that. Yeah, I know.
So when you use the elastic resistance, that makes your rib cage cramp?
Yeah, because I'm drawing in such a strong breath through muscles that I think are just weak and underworked.
Makes me think that you're breathing at end range. So think FRC concept, right? So like your breathing muscles at end range are deconditioned. I have this tool, and you guys have seen it, my belt that looks like my mover's belt, right? It's called a breath belt. And essentially it's an elastic. It would be the equivalent of, an elastic wrap, but it's a little bit more stiff and the tension's a little higher. And so you can actually use it for applying respiratory resistance to, you can wear it low and you can apply it so that you're getting mostly diaphragm resistance, or you can put it up higher on the ribs and do the same thing. I found that even wearing that in Metcons or warm-ups and things like that might be a really good tool for someone who does have breathing cramping or respiratory muscle cramps. Might be a good way to train that.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that.
Yeah. Another tool that I would use is any form of isometrics with a focus on breath. So I've just been recently doing a bunch more of the gymnastics bodies protocols, which are really long duration holds. So like the first step of one of their muscle ups progressions is be able to hold a ring to chest isometric hold for a minute and then repeat that for 5 sets, 5 minutes of bent arm hang, which is hard.
Yeah.
And doing that, you realize like how easy it is to just brace and not breathe at all.
Yeah, I would hold my breath for sure.
But if you have to do it for 5 minutes, you start to realize like, oh, I could hold this amount of tension and then still breathe. The breath is not the same as when you're unloaded, but I think the coordination of understanding, all right, I'm under load, this is what a breath cycle feels like. Like just getting that little, I don't know, it's almost like a motor pattern, like developing that motor pattern.
Yeah, the coordination for sure.
Yeah, has translated to other things. We did a camp where you did a whole bracing. I think your big skill is to do that while barbell cycling.
Yeah.
So it definitely is an important skill, and you can kind of practice it with gymnastics or isometrics.
Yeah, I think an even like further regressed version of practicing it is doing something like an RKC hard style plank hold, where you're basically in a front plank and you're working on driving and creating max tension from fingertips all the way to toes, max effort, and then do it for like 50 seconds and see if you can. I mean, obviously 50 seconds, you have to start breathing if you're like creating that much blood pressure and tension.
I'm laughing because we had our on-site group like 2 or 3 years ago, and I demonstrated that and stood up and almost blacked myself out. I was like, oh shit.
Oh, I've seen some weird stuff out of that. I've seen people fart doing it. I mean, max effort, driving tension.
Max effort, shit my pants.
But you'll have to learn, you have to deal with the coordination. I think that's the best way to say it of where do I draw air in while still maintaining like strong core tension. I think that's like the simple first step I do for someone that I see that needs more midline bracing integrity under high respiration.
Cool. We've also talked a little bit about positional breathing before. So would it be something where you might have someone get into, so like a goblet squat, and then hold the bottom position and just focus on breathing through the tension in the bottom of a goblet squat or something like that? Would that be a second step in your eyes for that athlete? So you'd start with like simple plank, then move to something more complex like goblet squat. What would the progression look like for them?
I mean, that could be a progression. I wouldn't say that's a progression from bracing under high tension. That's kind of a different problem for me. Right. I would say that's more about, I look at a position that they seem to be really bad at breathing in, like thrusters, for example. Let me put them in the bottom of a front squat and accumulate a ton of time under tension there, working on getting comfortable in that position, learning how to inhale and actually draw in an equal amount of air as if they were just standing up. So like part of one of my screens when I start on with a new client, I think I got this from you a while back, was we just do a regular standing breath count, like basically inhale as much air as you can, pinch your nose, and then count audibly as long as you can, very clearly, and just count up from 1, going as far as you can. And then I do the same thing in the bottom of a squat. So it's just kind of a quick assessment for me to see, okay, how much air can they draw in certain positions.
I've been using that for probably 3 years now.
Yeah.
And I often see a pretty big discrepancy between a standing and a squatting breath count, which shows you, I mean, the breath count's a proxy for someone's lung volume. So what that's showing you is that the compression is essentially reducing their ability to take air in. They have a lower lung volume, not it's not that their lungs are technically smaller. It's just that they can't use them in that squat position as effectively. And so, going in and doing some position specific breathing might be a really good way to address that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it makes sense that if you change the orientation of your pelvic girdle and your thorax, you actually will change your functional lung volume. So like when you do a normal, you go and do a screen and you blow into an FE6, which is like a little tool that tells you how much lung volume you have.
The picometer.
Yep. You can do it standing up. And it's like, all right, that's great. It probably will translate pretty well to running because that's the posture pretty similar to the posture that you'll be in your upper body when you're running. But if you talk about now being enduring while you're deadlifting or while you're doing toes to bar, now the orientation of your pelvic girdle and your thoracic cage is changing all the time. So if your breath cycle doesn't match when you're at a normal neutral position, you're not going to have the same lung volume. So it's a hard thing. Like maybe it needs to be research over time on that.
Well, to that point, I think you just brought up what the next major issue that I see in CrossFitters is, which is that they get into this idea that they have to link their breathing or their breath cycle to the cadence of the movement. The best example I have, and this one most people will be aware of, is wall ball, right? So most people have a cadence with their wall ball where it's like, they breathe in when the ball is touching the target, and then they like kind of hold their breath into the bottom to brace. This is for most people, not elite, right? So as they drop into the bottom, they hold their breath and they exhale on the way up, right? So it's a pretty connected breath cycle. Well, what happens when that's wall balls all of a sudden paired with 400-meter runs at, at mile pace, and your respiration rate is so high that you can't link your breathing to the cadence of the movement? Can you breathe through the movement? Can you breathe or do you have to stop? And I think that's one of the big issues that I see and try and teach people is that like, it's okay to disconnect your breathing from the movement as long as the movement's light enough. You've touched on this on barbell cycling where it's like, to cycle a heavy barbell, you're going to have to connect your breathing to the, you're going to have to get this brace and big inhale before you start. But at light 75-pound snatches, is that the case?
Yeah. I tell people on something like that, like they're like, I don't know how to breathe and I barbell cycle. I'm like, well, it's usually easier to breathe when you're not under tension. So wherever you're not under tension in the movement, that's where you want to try and get your breath of air in, and then you hold it basically for the parts that you need to create tension, right? So if I'm doing touch and go power snatches, I'm going to breathe in on the eccentric on the way down because I'm not under max tension on the way down, right? But on the way up, that's where I need to be braced to work on driving power and creating tension through the midline.
Yeah, that's another, this is not another problem. This is maybe just another iteration of that same problem, is that people don't think of the breath hold as part of the breath cycle. But really a breath is not inhale, exhale. It's inhale, pause, exhale, pause. Now, if you're breathing really fast, the time scale of those pauses is almost imperceptible, but you can breathe in, hold your breath for a second while you do a movement or while you go through part of a movement, breathe out, hold, breathe in. And so the cycle can be not in, out, it's in, hold, out, hold, in, hold. And I think people need to understand that, especially in CrossFit, holding your breath or bracing and temporarily holding your breath is going to be part of the necessity of getting a movement done and protecting your spine at the same time.
So you've got a lot of experience swimming, bilateral or breathing from one side. Which one's better?
So it really depends on, better would be dependent. I think that's probably the best way to put it. So first off, if you're racing, you should always breathe to the side that is going to disrupt your stroke the least. So for example, my breath to my left side is allows me to maintain a higher cadence just for whatever reason. Maybe I practiced it more when I was younger or something like that. So if I'm racing, I'm going to breathe to the left side the whole time.
Yep.
Now, when it comes to training, what I want to do most of the time is I want to make sure that my stroke is balanced between left and right side. If I only breathe to my left side, I overuse my right shoulder because it's deeper in the water with every stroke. If I breathe only to my right side, then my left shoulder is deeper in the water, right? So I'm going to end up with overuse injuries and an imbalance in my stroke. So when I train, I try to do bilateral, or if I'm in a pool, I'll often do like my odd laps are all to the left, my even laps are all to the right, or something like that, where I'm balancing out the stroke a little bit. Go ahead.
I'll say I wasn't asking that to like throw a complete tangent on swimming. I was just asking because it just goes to show that like I can't give someone a specific breathing pattern for a movement. It's going to depend, right? So just like with swimming, like some people prefer to bilateral breathe and they just pick that up naturally and that's what feels the best. Some people just breathe out of one side. I can't tell you exactly how to breathe on a wall ball. You got to find like what allows you to get air in the easiest and then like what little amount of tension you need and so forth.
Yeah, I think that is it's just a fundamental thing that I've come to understand coaching for a long enough time, is that everything has a very deep level of individuality. If somebody is 200 pounds and they're heavily muscled and they have a small lung volume, they might do the same movement with a faster breath count than somebody that's 160 pounds with a huge lung volume. and they might get the same score on the workout, and they both have found an optimal for them. But if I were to cue the 200-pound person to breathe the same way as the 160-pound person, I'd probably screw them over and actually make them worse as an athlete. So, and I mean, that's just a huge danger of, before this podcast, we were talking about a couple things, like Froning had told one of your athletes that they need to work on being able to hold their breath for a longer period of time. We were talking about stuff that Matt Frazier has done in competition or said in competition. And these are athletes that have definitely figured out what optimal is for them, how to breathe. Mm-hmm. But they're specific to them. So there might be some principles that you could apply that they have and that they do really damn well. But if you're mimicking people that are elite in any capacity, I think you're doing yourself a disservice, because your body's going to be different. Your mind's going to be different. Your CO2 tolerance and starting point is different. The fluidity of your motion is different. So what I was hoping to get with this podcast is kind of more principle driven stuff. And then hopefully the people listening can think of it more like, all right, now I can explore with a little bit more of a mindful approach to it than us being like, hey, do this because this works. Because I think that type of advice is dangerous for people.
Well, so to kind of go back into that, principles that we've talked about, number one is like a breath retention CO2 tolerance thing. You should probably be exploring that.
What's a good score? So if someone just wants a starting point, they don't know, okay, how long should I be able to hold my breath?
The test is what's called the BOLT test, BOLT test. Yep. And a good score, according to Patrick McCowan, is 40 plus, but I've assessed
while you breathe out.
That's an exhale breath hold. So
breathe out.
To be clear, look up how to do the BOLT test before you do it. Don't just hold your breath, because that's not a BOLT test. Look up very specifically the BOLT test. You should be doing it first thing in the morning, right when you wake up. Before you've done any exercise, any nose breathing stuff, it should be the first thing you do. A good score, according to Pat, is 40 plus. Now, whether or not, I've never seen anybody get over like 25 or 26. And people, when they first do it, I was like an 11, which he has in like the breathing dysfunction category, which is pretty accurate. Like I do a Metcon, and
FMS is around the same too. Like if you're less than 20, it's considered a dysfunction.
So before you go, I would say before you go into any of the breath hold tools that we talked about, even some of the nasal breathing stuff, if you're not at a 20, like that's your first step is to develop your CO2 tolerance to the point that you're at a 20.
Yep. Agreed.
All right. So that's a good starting point. Other tools or other references. So I already talked about our YouTube playlist. So you could check that out. Any other podcasts that we've talked about, or you've talked about breathing on some other podcasts as well?
I was just recently on the Upside Strength podcast with Sean Seeley, and we talked a little bit about, we talked for like 45 minutes about breathing, breath holds, how to integrate it into training and things like that. So there's some more info there.
Yeah. In the classroom, I did the YouTube series that's free, that's breathing playlist, is tied to a classroom piece that we have, which is basically an educational tool for coaches that teaches how to prescribe different types of training. And there's some IMT protocols in there that people could check out.
Yeah, we got an IMT, basically like a how-to, and then a 12-week program that's in the classroom as well. So if you want to learn more about that, use it in training.
Cool. Some book references: Breathe by James Nestor, we mentioned. Oxygen Advantage, we mentioned. What was the other breathing book we talked about before?
Inspiratory, Expiratory muscle training book.
Breathe Strong, Perform Better.
Yeah, Breathe Strong, Perform Better. I think that's good. I think that's a good starting point. If you guys have questions specific to breathing, how to get better at breathing, specific types of Metcon breathing, whatever it is, post them in the comments on our YouTube, and we can do a follow-up on the breathing as a concept.
Cool.